The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed their relentless, sterile song as 3-year-old Emma sat rigid on a wooden bench, her small legs swinging slightly above the cold floor. Her grandmother sat beside her with an arm wrapped protectively around the child's shoulders, though Emma seemed not to notice the gesture. The girl stared straight ahead at nothing in particular, her thumb lodged firmly in her mouth, her other hand gripping a tattered teddy bear whose button eyes had long since lost their shine. Her weathered face was etched with deep lines of worry, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying an impossible burden. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks exactly since that terrible night when Officer had arrived at the apartment with his siren screaming into the darkness. 3 weeks since Emma had witnessed something no child should ever witness. And in those 21 days, the little girl hadn't spoken a single word to anyone. Not to her grandmother, not to the paramedics who examined her, not to the social workers who asked gentle questions in soft voices. Not even to the child psychologist who came to the hospital with toys and puppets and patients. Emma had simply sealed her mouth shut and locked the door to her voice, leaving everyone on the outside, desperate and confused. Squeezed her eyes closed, fighting back tears that had become far too familiar over these past weeks. She'd raised Emma since birth when her own daughter, Emma's mother, had proven unprepared for motherhood, had bottle-fed her, changed countless diapers, taught her to walk, celebrated her first words with joy. And now those hard-won words had disappeared, swallowed by trauma and fear. The journey to this courthouse had been agonizing. After that night, the state had become involved. Emma's mother had initially claimed that Emma had simply fallen and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table, but the bruises told a different story. They were in the wrong places for a fall. There were fingerprint-shaped marks on tiny arms. The emergency room doctor's notes were clinical but clear, signs consistent with non-accidental trauma. Child Protective Services had moved quickly, removing Emma from her mother's home and placing her in custody while investigations proceeded. But the real problem was the silence, the absolute deafening silence. The psychiatrist they'd seen, a kind woman named Dr. Lena with gentle hands and an even gentler voice, had explained it in terms that were simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. Trauma-induced mutism, she called it, a psychological response to overwhelming fear or pain. Emma's mind had essentially hit a reset button, protecting itself the only way it knew how, by refusing to produce sound. Doctor had assured that it wasn't permanent, that with time and proper support, Emma would likely recover her ability to speak. But likely wasn't a guarantee, and time felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. Because there was going to be a custody hearing today, and without Emma's testimony the case was impossibly weak. The state had circumstantial evidence, sure, marks on her body, inconsistent stories from her mother, a report from a neighbor who'd heard screaming, but nothing concrete, nothing that would definitively prove what had happened in that apartment that night. In the absence of a child's voice, the courts moved cautiously, bound by protocol and procedure. Emma's mother had a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named who specialized in custody cases, and had an excellent track record of getting her clients what they wanted. Judge would be hearing the case, had done her research, 30 years on the bench, a reputation for being fair but strict, a woman who believed in evidence and procedure, had read through profiles and case summaries, looking for some clue about whether the judge would see past the silence, whether she would understand that Emma's inability to speak wasn't a reflection of lack of evidence, but rather a symptom of trauma itself. Checked the clock on the wall. 20 minutes until they were called into the courtroom. She felt Emma's small frame trembling slightly next to her, though she couldn't tell if it was from cold. The courthouse was aggressively air-conditioned or from fear, probably fear. Everything terrified Emma now. Loud noises made her flinch. Sudden movements caused her to withdraw further into herself. Had learned to move slowly, to speak in whispers, to give the child space while still offering presence. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," whispered, knowing it was a lie. Nothing about this was okay. But she said it anyway because sometimes lies were the only thing a grandmother could offer when reality was too cruel to bear. The courthouse hallway was filling up now. Attorneys in suits checking their phones, social workers with clipboards and concerned expressions, other families with their own crises, their own shattered moments playing out in different rooms behind different doors. This hallway had witnessed thousands of dramas, thousands of decisions that altered lives forever. Emma was just one small child in an endless procession of human suffering. That's when heard the click of a leash and the distinctive jingle of dog tags. Officer rounded the corner, his uniform pressed and professional, but it was the creature beside him that captured attention. A German shepherd of exceptional beauty, with a coat the color of burnished mahogany and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The dog moved with the confident grace of a well-trained animal, keeping perfect pace with her handler, her head held at just the right angle of attention and respect. Felt Emma's body stiffen beside her, not in fear but in something else entirely. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Some primal part of the child responding to the presence of another living being, uncomplicated and non-threatening. Officer was walking past, heading toward the courtroom for his own testimony in a drug trafficking case, when he happened to glance down. His experienced eyes caught something: the small girl, the rigid posture, the complete and absolute stillness of a traumatized child. He'd seen enough trauma cases to recognize the signs immediately. His hand briefly hesitated on Bella's leash as his detective instincts kicked in. He didn't know who this child was. He didn't know about the apartment, the bruises, the 3 weeks of silence. But he knew what he saw: a little girl who needed help, even if she couldn't ask for it. Officer had been a K-9 handler for 15 years, and in that time he'd learned to trust his instincts implicitly. Bella wasn't just his partner. She was an extension of his intuition, a four-legged instrument attuned to human suffering in ways that no academy training could explain. As he walked past the small girl and her grandmother, something made him pause. It was subtle, a moment of hesitation, a shift in his awareness, but it was enough. He stopped, turned slightly, and really looked at the child on the bench. What he saw broke his heart. Emma's eyes had tracked Bella with unmistakable intensity, the first sign of genuine emotional engagement rather than blank dissociation. It was a small thing, a child noticing a dog, but to Officer it was a beacon. In his years working with trauma victims, he'd learned that sometimes connection came through the most unexpected channels. He'd brought Bella to hospitals to comfort dying patients. He'd positioned her at crime scenes to help witnesses overcome their shock. He'd even sat with her in psychiatric wards, where her presence seemed to communicate something that human language could not. "Excuse me," he said gently, approaching with respectful deference. His tone was warm but professional, his posture non-threatening. "I'm Officer, this is Bella, my partner." He said it simply, offering information without pressure or expectation. Looked up, wariness crossing her features. She was protective, rightly so, and this was a stranger approaching her and her traumatized granddaughter. "Hello," replied cautiously, her hand moving protectively to Emma's shoulder. Noticed the movement, the tension in his body, and he adjusted his approach accordingly. "I don't mean to intrude," he said softly, "but I'm noticing your granddaughter seems interested in Bella. Sometimes kids respond to dogs in ways they respond to people, especially if they're going through something difficult. Would it be okay if Bella said hello?" His first instinct was to refuse. She was protective of Emma, wary of anything that might upset her further. But something in Officer's eyes, a genuine compassion that extended beyond professionalism, made her hesitate. And more importantly, she saw something shift in Emma. The girl's body had leaned slightly forward, her grip on her teddy bear loosening marginally. For the first time in 3 weeks, her eyes had focused on something external, on something living and present. Yes, that's okay," heard herself say. Officer knelt down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. Bella immediately understood the shift in his body language and sat attentively beside him, her tail wagging gently. "Bella," he said softly to the dog, then glanced toward Emma. "This is Emma. Be gentle, girl." What happened next would stay with for the rest of her life. Emma's tiny hand reached out tentatively, as if moving through water. Her small fingers made contact with Bella's fur, and something in the child's face transformed. It wasn't a dramatic change, no sudden smile or burst of energy, but rather a gradual softening, like ice beginning to thaw under spring sunshine. The rigidity that had characterized Emma's body for weeks seemed to melt away. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw unclenched. The teddy bear slipped slightly in her grip. Bella, with the intuitive wisdom that well-trained therapy dogs possessed, turned her head toward the child and gently nudged Emma's hand. The dog didn't jump or lick excitedly. She simply offered her presence, steady and unwavering. Emma, emboldened by this quiet acceptance, reached her other hand up and buried both small fists in Bella's neck fur, burying her face against the dog's shoulder. Felt tears spring to her eyes. She watched as her granddaughter, this traumatized, silent child who hadn't sought comfort from anyone in weeks, allowed herself to collapse against the warmth and solidness of the dog. Emma's small body shook slightly and realized the child was crying. Finally, after 3 weeks, she was crying. Silent tears that slipped down her cheeks and disappeared into Bella's fur, but tears nonetheless. Officer remained kneeling, his hand on Bella's back, giving Emma the space to process whatever emotions were flooding through her. He'd seen this reaction before. Sometimes the non-judgmental presence of an animal created a safe container for feelings that were too overwhelming to express to another human being. A dog didn't ask questions. A dog didn't require explanation. A dog simply accepted what was happening with complete, unconditional presence. Reached over and placed her trembling hand on Emma's back, feeling her granddaughter's small body shudder with each silent sob. "It's okay, baby," whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It's okay. Let it out. Just let it out." The three of them remained there for several minutes, the officer, the dog, the grandmother, and the traumatized child, suspended in a moment of profound healing. People walked past in the hallway, caught up in their own dramas and crises, largely oblivious to the transformation occurring on this wooden bench. But for time seemed to stop. She was witnessing her granddaughter beginning to thaw, beginning to trust, beginning to move toward recovery. Eventually, Emma's tears slowed. She didn't release her grip on Bella's fur, but her breathing became more regular. Gently rubbed circles on her back, an officer remained patient and present, understanding that breaking this connection too quickly would be a mistake. "She needed this," said softly to officer, her voice wavering with gratitude. "I don't know how I know that, but she needed this so badly." Nodded, his understanding reflected in his eyes. "Sometimes we don't have words for what we need," he said quietly. "Sometimes we just need another living being to sit with us in our pain." He paused, then added, "Is Emma testifying today, in a case?" Shoulders tensed slightly. "Yes, in about 10 minutes, but I don't know if she'll be able to. She hasn't spoken since." She stopped, not wanting to say it aloud, not wanting to acknowledge the reality of Emma's condition. Officer seemed to understand without needing to hear the words. "Would it help if Bella were present?" he asked. "I can't speak for the judge, but I could ask. Sometimes having an animal companion nearby can give a child courage they didn't know they had." Looked down at Emma, still clinging to Bella, still drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. An idea was forming, fragile and uncertain but possible. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I think it would." Officer stood slowly, giving Emma a few more moments with Bella before gently speaking. "Emma," he said softly, "Bella and I need to go do something, but I think we might see you again soon. Is that okay?" Emma didn't respond verbally. She hadn't spoken in 3 weeks after all. But she looked up at Officer with eyes that seemed older than her 3 years, eyes that had seen too much. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then looked back at Bella, memorizing every detail of this dog who had somehow helped her feel safe in an unsafe world. As Officer and Bella walked away, held Emma close, whispering promises of what might come next, hoping that the dog's presence in the courtroom might somehow unlock the words that had been locked away so deeply inside her traumatized granddaughter. Judge sat at her bench, reviewing the case file one final time before proceedings began. 30 years on the judicial bench had taught her that cases involving children required extraordinary care, but this particular file troubled her deeply. The evidence was circumstantial at best. A child's injuries, yes. Inconsistent statements from the mother, certainly. But without the victim's testimony, without hearing directly from Emma about what had occurred that night, the case was fragile as tissue paper. The judge was 62 years old, her dark hair streaked with distinguished silver, her brown eyes sharp and analytical behind stylish glasses. She'd presided over thousands of cases, divorces, adoptions, custody disputes, but cases involving child abuse always landed differently. They stayed with her. They interrupted her sleep. They reminded her why she'd pursued law in the first place, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She heard a knock on her chamber door. Officer entered, respectful but purposeful, with Bella at his side. Judge looked up with immediate skepticism. In her courtroom, procedure mattered, tradition mattered. Animals in the judicial process were not part of that tradition. "Your Honor," Officer began carefully, "I'm aware this is highly irregular, but I want to bring something to your attention regarding Emma Richardson's testimony today." Judge set down her pen and folded her hands on her desk, her judicial demeanor firmly in place. "Officer, I'm familiar with your work. You're an excellent handler and a dedicated officer, but I'm not sure what this has to do with today's proceedings." "Child hasn't spoken in 3 weeks," said carefully. "She's experiencing trauma-induced mutism. Her grandmother tells me that Emma had a significant emotional response to Bella about 20 minutes ago in the hallway. It was the first genuine engagement with any living being since the incident." He paused, choosing his words with precision. "I'm not suggesting anything radical, Your Honor. Simply that Bella's presence in the courtroom might provide the emotional support Emma needs to testify. To find her voice." Judge leaned back in her chair, considering. Protocol said no. Procedure said no. Every textbook on courtroom conduct said no. But then she thought about Emma, this tiny child who had been failed by the adults in her life and was now being asked to relive trauma through testimony. She thought about the frustration of having evidence but no voice to confirm it. "1 hour, Judge said finally. I'll allow Bella to be present, but she must remain calm and controlled. She cannot interact with anyone during proceedings. And officer, if this disrupts the testimony in any way, we're done." "Understood." Relief flashed across face. "Thank you, Your Honor. You won't regret this." The courtroom was a study in contrast. Imposing wood paneling, high ceilings, the formal architecture of justice. Yet somehow it felt like a stage set for human drama. Sat in the front row with Emma, the child pressed against her side, holding her grandmother's hand so tightly that its fingers had gone slightly numb. Emma wore a pale pink dress that had chosen carefully, something soft and comforting that didn't feel like courtroom formality. Her hair had been brushed gently and pulled into a small ponytail with a ribbon at the end. When Officer walked in with Bella, Emma's entire body stiffened. But this time it wasn't in fear. Felt her granddaughter's hand grip hers even, and she noticed Emma's eyes were riveted on the dog. Bella was positioned on a specially arranged cushion near the judge's bench, visible to Emma but out of the central flow of the courtroom. The attorneys took their places. Emma's mother sat at the defendant's table, her lawyer beside her. The defense attorney looked confident and sharp, armed with arguments and legal precedent. The prosecutor, James Mitchell, looked grim and determined. The court reporter took her position, ready to record every word. Judge entered, and everyone rose. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with the careful eye of someone accustomed to seeing beneath surfaces. Her gaze rested momentarily on Bella, and something almost unreadable crossed her face. Then she turned her attention to the matter at hand. "We're here regarding the custody petition in the matter of Emma Richardson," Judge began, her voice carrying the formal cadence of the law. "The court has received testimony regarding alleged injuries to the minor child. Today, we'll be hearing from the child herself regarding the circumstances that led to those injuries." Squeezed Emma's hand. A social worker who specialized in child testimony was brought in to question Emma. The woman was kind and experienced, her voice gentle as she began with simple, non-threatening questions. "Emma, do you know why you're here today?" Silence. "Can you tell me what happened at your mommy's house?" Silence. The questioning continued for 10 minutes and Emma remained completely mute, her jaw locked tight, her eyes staring at some point in the distance. Felt her heart sinking. This was a disaster. The judge was going to find insufficient evidence. Emma's mother would get custody, and history might repeat itself. The prosecutor looked increasingly frustrated. The defense attorney allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Then something shifted. Judge leaned forward slightly and said something unexpected, something that deviated from protocol. "Emma," the judge said gently, her voice carrying an unusual warmth, "if you feel scared or worried, you can hold Bella's paw. Would that help you feel braver?" Emma's eyes moved from their distant focus to the judge. Then they tracked to Bella. The dog, understanding on some intuitive level that this child needed her, stood and moved the few steps toward the witness stand, her leash held loosely by Officer. Emma's hand stretched out, her small fingers making contact with Bella's soft fur. Something unlocked. It was as if a key had been turned in a lock that had remained sealed for 3 weeks. Emma's body seemed to decompress, the tension draining from her shoulders like water through a sieve. She wrapped her small hand around Bella's paw, grounding herself in the physical connection. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Emma, can you tell us what happened that night? What did your mommy do?" Silence still, but a different kind of silence, a silence filled with potential. "It's okay, Emma," the prosecutor said softly. "You're safe here, just tell us what you remember." Emma opened her mouth. Her throat worked. A sound emerged, barely audible, a whisper so faint that those in the gallery had to strain to hear it. Her eyes were fixed on Bella's, drawing strength from the dog's steady gaze. "Mommy hurt." 3 words, no 2 words, but they seemed to echo through the courtroom like thunder, though they'd been spoken in barely more than a breath. Judge's pen fell from her hand, clattering onto her desk. The courtroom fell into absolute, profound silence. In that moment, everyone understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A broken child had found her voice. Justice had been given a pathway forward. The prosecutor continued carefully, asking gentle follow-up questions. Emma, still holding Bella's paw, spoke in whispered fragments about what she'd seen that night. Her words painted a picture of violence and terror, but more importantly, her words confirmed what the evidence had suggested, that this child had been abused by her mother's boyfriend, and that her mother had not protected her. When the testimony concluded an hour later, Emma was still holding Bella's paw. Judge removed her glasses and wiped her eyes, a gesture that shocked the entire courtroom, as judicial demeanor typically forbade such displays of emotion. "I'm going to require a brief recess," the judge announced, her voice thick with feeling. "When we reconvene, I will have a ruling on custody. Court is adjourned." As people began to move, Emma finally released Bella's paw, but only to bury her face in the dog's neck, her small body shaking with the aftermath of what she'd accomplished. She had spoken truth. She had been heard. And in that moment, everything changed. Judge sat alone in her chambers, the door locked behind her, her judicial robes discarded and draped over the back of her leather chair. She'd removed her glasses and was rubbing her eyes with the heels of her hands, a gesture of exhaustion and emotional overwhelm that she would never have allowed in public. Her hands were shaking slightly, something that hadn't happened to her in decades. 23 years on the bench. 23 years of maintaining composure, of preserving judicial demeanor, of keeping her personal reactions locked away behind a professional. She'd presided over custody cases involving children before. She'd heard testimony from abused minors. She'd made decisions that altered the trajectories of young lives, but she'd never witnessed anything quite like what had just occurred in her courtroom. Those two words, "mommy hurt," continued to echo in her mind with the weight of a church bell tolling. They were simple words, the kind a 3-year-old might use to describe a scraped knee or a harsh word. But in context, spoken by a traumatized child who hadn't uttered a single syllable in 3 weeks, they carried the force of absolute truth. They were a testimony distilled to its essence, stripped of all pretense and artifice. Judge stood and walked to her window, looking out over the city below. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets, people moving about their ordinary lives, unaware of the extraordinary moment that had just unfolded in this building. She thought about all the times she'd sat on this bench, waiting for witnesses to speak clearly, waiting for evidence to present itself conclusively. She'd always believed in the system, in the power of law and procedure to reveal truth. But today, she'd witnessed something the system hadn't prepared her for: the power of an animal's simple, unconditional presence to unlock a child's capacity to speak truth. Her intercom buzzed. "Your Honor, the attorneys are asking when you'll reconvene." Judge straightened her shoulders, drew in a deep breath, and returned to her desk. She pressed the button. "Give me 10 more minutes, and please summon officer to my chambers. Tell him to bring the dog." When officer arrived with Bella, the judge was fully composed again, though her eyes were still slightly red. Noticed immediately, he'd worked with enough judges to recognize when they were struggling with emotion. He entered respectfully, Bella at his side. "Officer," Judge said formally, though her voice carried an undertone of genuine gratitude, "I want to thank you. What you facilitated today, I've never seen anything like it in my entire career." Nodded respectfully. "Emma needed a bridge, Your Honor. Bella provided that bridge." The judge stood and moved to her window, her hands clasped behind her back. "I've been sitting here, trying to process what just happened, trying to reconcile it with everything I was taught about courtroom procedure, about judicial standards." She turned back to face him. "I violated protocol today. I allowed an animal into my courtroom during sensitive testimony. I deviated from standard questioning procedures. I broke at least 3 established guidelines." "Did justice suffer?" Officer asked quietly. Judge smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "No, for perhaps the first time in my career, justice was actually served more effectively because we broke the rules." She paused, then continued thoughtfully. "That little girl had something important to tell us. Our system wasn't giving her the tools to tell it. We had to create something new." She moved back to her desk and sat down, her fingers steepled together. "Tell me about Bella's training. Tell me about this therapy animal work you do." For the next 15 minutes, Officer explained the fundamentals of his K-9 program. He discussed the specific training that therapy dogs underwent, the research showing the calming effects of animal presence on trauma victims, the success stories he'd witnessed. He spoke about dogs' ability to sense anxiety and respond with nonverbal reassurance. He talked about the absence of judgment that animals offered. They didn't question, didn't doubt, didn't demand. They simply accepted. Judge listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her judicial mind processing information methodically. By the time Officer finished, she had made a decision. "I want to learn more about this," she said decisively. "Not just for today's case, but for our entire system. Officer, I'm going to request that you research courthouse therapy animal programs in other states. I want information on how they're structured, what kind of training is involved, what the legal and procedural implications are." Raised his eyebrows slightly. "You're considering implementing a program here?" "I'm considering the possibility that we've been administering justice with one hand tied behind our backs," Judge replied. Today showed me that there's another way, a more humane way, to handle cases involving traumatized witnesses, particularly children. If this can work in other courthouses, it can work here. When court reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted subtly. People sensed that something significant had occurred during the recess, though they couldn't quite articulate what. Held Emma close, the child now calm and somewhat drowsy, her small body finally relaxed after weeks of tension. Judge took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with fresh purpose. Based on the testimony heard today, she began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, and the supporting evidence already entered into the record, this court finds that there is clear and convincing evidence of child abuse. The minor child, Emma Richardson, has demonstrated through her testimony that she was subjected to non-accidental trauma in the home of her biological mother. She paused, her gaze moving to Emma's mother, who sat frozen in her chair, the reality of what was about to happen beginning to dawn on her face. Custody of Emma Richardson is hereby awarded to her grandmother, Richardson, pending a permanent custody determination in 30 days. The child's mother is awarded supervised visitation only, contingent upon completion of a psychological evaluation and anger management counseling. The court finds that the child's safety and are paramount concerns that outweigh parental rights in this instance. The gavel came down, a sound that seemed to echo with finality and relief. Felt Emma's small body go limp against her, and she realized her granddaughter was crying. But these were different tears than before. These were tears of relief, of release, of survival. She held Emma close, whispering words of love and safety, understanding that her granddaughter had just spoken her way to protection. The defense attorney was objecting, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Judge's decision had been clear, and her tone brooked no argument. The prosecutor smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction that justice had in fact been served. But Judge's attention wasn't on the attorneys. Her gaze was fixed on Emma and Bella, on the small child still clinging to the dog's fur, on the profound transformation that had occurred in that courtroom. She was thinking about all the other Emmas out there, traumatized children struggling to find their voices in a system that wasn't designed to listen to whispers. As people filed out of the courtroom, Judge made a phone call from her bench to the Chief Judge's office. She scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss something that was going to change the entire trajectory of her career, a proposal for a courthouse-wide therapy animal program. What had begun with a 3-year-old's whispered words was already rippling outward, ready to transform an entire system. 3 days had passed since Emma's testimony, and Judge hadn't slept more than a few hours each night. She sat at her home office, surrounded by research materials, printed articles, case studies, legal journals, all relating to therapy animals in judicial settings. Her kitchen table had been transformed into an informal research center, with highlighters, sticky notes, and half-empty coffee cups scattered across its surface. Her cats, confused by the disruption to their usual peaceful household, had retreated to the bedroom. Judge had always been meticulous, but this particular research project had consumed her with an intensity she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if Emma's 2 whispered words had awakened something dormant within her, a recognition that the law, for all its precision and procedure, was sometimes too rigid to accommodate human healing. The research revealed a landscape that both thrilled and frustrated her. California had established a formal courthouse companion animal program in 2015, working with therapy dog handlers to support vulnerable witnesses. New York had implemented similar initiatives. Washington State had a comprehensive program with multiple courthouses participating. Seattle's program had been operating for 7 years, with documented success rates showing significantly increased testimony from traumatized witnesses when animals were present. But her own state, nothing, not a single official program. hundreds of children testifying annually without any emotional support mechanism. Countless vulnerable witnesses forced to navigate the judicial system in the most terrifying moments of their lives, facing judges and attorneys and hostile cross-examination with no ally in the room. Judge downloaded research papers from peer-reviewed journals. She found studies from trauma psychologists demonstrating that the presence of therapy animals significantly reduced cortisol levels and increased oxytocin production in stressed individuals. She read about dogs' ability to detect anxiety through scent markers and respond with calming behaviors. She discovered academic literature on the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and legal proceedings. Most importantly, she found herself moved by the personal stories embedded in case studies. Children who'd finally spoken their truth when an animal was present. Witnesses who'd found courage they didn't know they possessed. Families who'd found justice because a dog had provided the bridge between silence and words. On Friday morning, Judge sent Officer an email. "Coffee tomorrow. I need to discuss something important." They met at a small across from the courthouse, a place where off-duty officers and judicial staff often gathered informally. Judge arrived first, securing a corner table where they could speak privately. When Officer arrived with Bella, who always accompanied him off-duty, stood to greet them. It was unusual for a judge to meet casually with an officer in such an informal setting, but both of them understood they were embarking on something that transcended normal professional boundaries. "Thank you for meeting me," Judge began, setting down her coffee cup. "I've spent the past 72 hours doing research, extensive research." She pulled out a folder containing her findings. Over the next hour, she walked Officer through everything she discovered. The programs in other states, the research demonstrating effectiveness, the legal frameworks that allowed animals in courtrooms, the training requirements, the liability considerations. Officer listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, while Bella rested her head on his lap. The dog seemed to understand that this was serious business, as if she could sense the weight of the conversation. "What I'm realizing," Judge continued, "is that Emma's breakthrough wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration of something that's already proven to work elsewhere. We're not inventing something new, we're adapting something that already exists. But in this state, in this court system, we're acting as though it doesn't exist." "What are you proposing?" Officer asked, though Judge suspected he already knew. "I'm proposing that we develop a formal courthouse companion animal program," Judge said with quiet determination. "Not just in my courtroom, but district-wide. Initially in cases involving child witnesses or vulnerable victims. Eventually, if it proves successful, potentially expanding to other categories of cases." Officer leaned back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "Your Honor, that's ambitious. That's transformative." "Call me outside the courtroom," Judge said with a slight smile. "And yes, it is ambitious, but consider what we witnessed with Emma. That child couldn't speak. The system was prepared to move forward on circumstantial evidence, potentially allowing her abuser to maintain contact with her. Then a dog entered the room, and suddenly justice became possible." She paused, leaning forward with intensity. "How many other Emmas are there in our system right now? How many traumatized children are struggling to testify? How many witnesses are failing to disclose abuse or crimes because they can't overcome their fear? What if we could change that? What if we could make our courtrooms places of healing as well as justice?" Officer was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that would define their partnership going forward. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'm in. But this isn't going to be easy. There's going to be resistance. Judges who see animals in courtrooms as unprofessional, attorneys who argue it's emotional manipulation, administrators worried about liability and protocol." "I know," Judge acknowledged. "That's why I need you. You understand the animal-assisted therapy side. You know what training is required, what behavioral standards must be met, what protocols need to be established. You're credible in law enforcement circles. Together, we might be able to convince people." Over the next 2 hours, they sketched out a preliminary plan. Officer would research and compile information about therapy dog training programs, establishing what standards would be necessary for courthouse work. Judge would begin preliminary conversations with other judges and court administrators, gauging openness to the concept. They would need to develop comprehensive protocols addressing selection and training criteria for dogs, handler qualifications and responsibilities, clear guidelines on when animals could be used initially, child witnesses, sexual assault victims, domestic violence survivors, procedures for animal behavior monitoring during proceedings, liability and insurance considerations, appeals process for defendants who wanted to challenge the animal's presence. "This is going to take time," officer warned. "Change in the judicial system doesn't happen quickly." "I know," Judge agreed. "But Emma has given us momentum. Her story, if we tell it carefully, ethically, can be a powerful advocate for this change. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one case. It was a demonstration of a better way." As they stood to leave, Bella pressed against Officer's leg, as if offering silent support for the journey they were beginning. Judge reached down to stroke the dog's head. "Bella," she said softly, "you might not realize it, but you're about to revolutionize our judicial system." The dog's tail wagged, utterly unaware of the historical significance she'd already achieved. Walking back to the courthouse, Judge felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of genuine purpose beyond the normal judicial duties. She was going to change the system. It might take months. It might take years. There would be obstacles, resistance, setbacks, but she had witnessed proof that change was not only possible but necessary. Emma's whispered words had awakened more than just her judicial conscience. They'd awakened a vision of what justice could look like when compassion was woven into its structure, and she was determined to make that vision a reality. The first formal meeting took place in the courthouse's administrative offices, a sterile conference room with gray walls and recessed lighting that seemed designed to drain the hope out of any ambitious proposal. Judge sat at the head of a long wooden table, flanked by Officer on one side and Dr. Lena, Emma's psychiatrist, whom they'd recruited to provide clinical support for their proposal, on the other. Across from them sat the triumvirate of judicial administration: Chief Judge, a man in his 70s whose face suggested he'd seen every trend in law come and go; Court Administrator Susan, no relation to Officer, a woman whose primary concern was budget and procedure; and Judge Harold, a conservative jurist known for his strict adherence to tradition. "So you want to bring dogs into courtrooms?" Judge said flatly, setting down his reading glasses. It wasn't a question so much as a statement of disbelief. "Trained therapy dogs under specific protocols in carefully selected cases," Judge clarified calmly. "We have research demonstrating efficacy. We have successful models from other states, and we have a recent example from our own courtroom that demonstrates the potential." Judge's expression hardened. "The Richardson case. I heard about your innovation. With respect, Judge, the judiciary is not a place for emotional experimentation. We are bound by procedure, by evidence, by law. Animals compromise that." "Animals compromise nothing," Officer interjected respectfully. "What they do is provide a mechanism for traumatized witnesses to access their own ability to communicate. The testimony is still the same. The evidence is still the same. We're simply removing an artificial barrier to truth-telling." Susan, the administrator, was reviewing a document in front of her. The liability implications alone would be enormous. What if a dog bites someone? What if it interferes with proceedings? What if defense attorneys challenge the testimony as influenced by emotional manipulation? "We have insurance models," Officer responded, producing a comprehensive folder. "Other states have addressed these exact concerns. The dogs are screened for temperament, certified through recognized therapy animal organizations, monitored continuously. We're not talking about random pets. These are professional working animals with specific training. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, nothing had been decided, but seeds of possibility had been planted. Judge asked for a formal proposal. Susan agreed to research insurance and liability options. Judge remained skeptical but didn't explicitly refuse to consider it. The months that followed were a grinding exercise in institutional persuasion. Judge discovered that changing a system that had operated the same way for decades required more than just good ideas. It required persistence, evidence, and political navigation. She began attending every judicial conference she could, giving informal presentations about therapy animals and trauma-informed justice. Officer worked with veterinary behaviorists and therapy animal organizations to develop comprehensive training and certification standards specifically for courthouse work. Doctor compiled research data and prepared clinical frameworks for how and when animals should be used. The resistance came from multiple angles. Judge sent her an article highlighting concerns about animals in professional settings, with a handwritten note. "I respect your passion, but this is a bridge too far." Other judges quietly expressed concerns about appearing soft on crime or compromised in their judicial authority by having animals in the courtroom. Defense attorneys raised concerns about undue emotional influence on witnesses. Some prosecutors worried that having animals present might complicate cross-examination procedures. But there were also unexpected allies. A prosecutor named Jennifer Martinez, who regularly handled sexual assault cases, approached Judge in the courthouse hallway. "I read your proposal," she said quietly. "I think it's brilliant. I've watched too many victims freeze on the stand. If this helps them speak, I'm supportive." A victims' rights advocate named Robert Washington scheduled a meeting and shared dozens of testimonials from survivors about how fear had prevented them from fully disclosing abuse. "If animals could help break through that fear," he said passionately, "that's not emotional manipulation. That's removing obstacles to justice." The turning point came when Judge arranged a presentation to the state judicial conference. She brought Officer and Bella. The large auditorium was filled with judges from across the state, some curious, some skeptical, most simply uncertain. Judge presented the research methodically. Peer-reviewed studies showing cortisol reduction in the presence of animals, testimony statistics from California and Washington courthouses, comparative analysis of conviction rates before and after implementation of animal programs. Officer demonstrated Bella's training and behavioral protocols. Doctor explained the psychological framework behind trauma-informed justice. Then Judge did something unexpected. She showed a video clip, with Emma's parents' permission, of Emma's testimony. Not the full testimony, just the moment where the child whispered "Mommy hurt" while holding Bella's paw. There was no audio, just the visual of a traumatized child finding her voice through connection with an animal. The auditorium was absolutely silent. "This child hadn't spoken in 3 weeks," Judge said quietly. "She was unable to testify about abuse she'd witnessed. This courtroom intervention, allowing a therapy dog to be present, enabled her to speak truth that protected her. That is the core of what we're proposing. Not emotional manipulation, but removal of barriers to justice." When the presentation ended, the response was stronger than she'd anticipated. Multiple judges approached her afterward requesting more information. The State Judicial Council agreed to commission a detailed feasibility study. Most importantly, Judge pulled her aside and said, "I'm impressed. This might actually work." The formal proposal took 6 months to develop. It was comprehensive and meticulous, 47 pages of protocols, training standards, liability frameworks, and procedural guidelines. That only dogs certified through recognized therapy animal organizations would qualify. Handlers must be law enforcement or court-employed professionals with specific training. Use would initially be limited to cases involving child witnesses, sexual assault survivors, and domestic violence victims. Each use required judicial discretion and approval. Clear guidelines governed animal behavior monitoring during proceedings. Defense attorneys would have an opportunity to challenge the animal's presence, with specific grounds for challenge. Comprehensive liability insurance would be maintained. An annual review process would assess program effectiveness. Judge and officer presented this proposal to the State Judicial Council in what she would later describe as the most important presentation of her professional life. The council voted on it. The vote was unanimous in favor of a 3-year pilot program. 12 courthouses would participate. 40 trained therapy dogs would be recruited and certified. Officer would coordinate the program across all locations. Judge would serve as judicial liaison and program director. When the vote concluded and the announcement was made, Judge felt tears threatening to spill. She caught Officer's eye across the room, and she saw her own emotion reflected in his expression. They'd done it. Against resistance, against skepticism, against the weight of institutional inertia, they'd done it. That evening, Judge went to her office and pulled out a photo she'd kept on her desk. Emma in her yellow dress, hugging Bella at the ribbon-cutting ceremony that hadn't happened yet but would soon. "Thank you," she whispered to the photograph, understanding that a 3-year-old girl's courage and a dog's simple presence had set in motion something that would transform justice for countless vulnerable people. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in her career, Judge understood the true meaning of hope. The morning of May 15th dawned bright and perfect, as if the weather itself was celebrating. The main courthouse steps had been transformed into a ceremonial space, with a podium, sound system, and rows of folding chairs arranged for what would become a historic moment in the state's judicial history. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metallic flowers. Reporters and camera crews moved about with purposeful energy, sensing that this was a story worth telling. Judge arrived early, dressed in formal business attire rather than her judicial robes, a deliberate choice to signal that this event was about more than just the judiciary. She walked the space mentally, visualizing how the ceremony would unfold. The State Judicial Council president would speak. The court administrator would discuss logistics. Officer would present the therapeutic dog program framework. And then, the part that made her heart flutter with anticipation, Emma would cut the ribbon. Emma, the 3-year-old girl who had whispered 2 words and changed everything. The child arrived at 10:30 a.m., now 4 years old, accompanied by her grandmother and officer, who brought Bella dressed in a special harness decorated with a ribbon that matched Emma's yellow dress. Emma was visibly nervous, her small hand gripping her grandmother's as they navigated through the growing crowd. Reporters immediately converged, but Officer, working with courthouse security, created a protective perimeter around the family. "Emma, how do you feel about today?" a reporter shouted. The child, who had worked extensively with a speech therapist over the past year, looked up and said in a clear, small voice, "I'm happy to see Bella." The simplicity and honesty of that statement seemed to crystallize something for everyone present. This wasn't about politics or judicial innovation or institutional change. At its heart, this was about a child and a dog and the healing that had emerged from their connection. Judge arrived and took the podium. His speech was measured and formal, acknowledging the program's historical significance while carefully nodding that it represented evolution, not revolution, in judicial practice. "We are not abandoning procedure," he emphasized. "We are enhancing our capacity to serve justice by removing barriers that prevent vulnerable witnesses from testifying fully and honestly." The State Judicial Council president spoke about the comprehensive research and the successful models in other states. Court Administrator Susan discussed the logistical frameworks and the rigorous training protocols. Everything was presented with the careful documentation and procedural language that the judicial system demanded. Then Officer approached the podium, and something shifted in the atmosphere. He wasn't reading from prepared remarks. He spoke directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked in the field and understood the reality of trauma. 3 years ago, I watched a little girl try to speak about her pain, he began. She couldn't find the words. The system couldn't find a way to help her access them, so we tried something different. We brought Bella into that courtroom, and this child found her voice. He paused, looking directly at Emma. Emma taught us that sometimes justice requires innovation. Sometimes healing and law can work together. This program exists because one child was brave enough to whisper the truth. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Judge then took the podium and outlined what the program would accomplish. 12 courthouses, 40 trained therapy dogs, carefully developed protocols, annual assessment and review. We're not experimenting blindly, she emphasized. This is evidence-based, professionally managed, and subject to rigorous oversight. But we're also recognizing something that Emma taught us, that sometimes the most powerful tools for justice are the simplest ones. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Emma, with her grandmother's encouragement, approached the ribbon-cutting station. A large ceremonial ribbon stretched across an archway that had been erected on the courthouse steps. Officer positioned Bella beside Emma, and the dog, understanding the significance of the moment with that uncanny animal wisdom, sat perfectly still, her attention focused entirely on the child. A photographer handed Emma oversized scissors, sized appropriately for her small hands. Reporters pressed forward with cameras clicking. Emma looked up at Officer, who nodded encouragingly. She looked at Bella, who wagged her tail gently. And then she looked at her grandmother, whose face was streaming with tears of pride and relief. Emma reached out and grasped the scissors. With her grandmother's hands guiding her, she cut through the ribbon. The ceremonial cut sent up a cheer from the assembled crowd. Journalists, judges, court administrators, advocates, and countless people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing pulled her granddaughter into her arms, holding her as cameras flashed and people applauded. Officer's hand rested on Bella's head, and even the dog seemed to understand the importance of the moment, maintaining her dignified posture while her entire body trembled with the energy of the celebration. In the weeks following the ribbon cutting, the program began its official operations. The 12 pilot courthouses received their assigned therapy dogs. Handlers underwent intensive training on courtroom protocols. Judges received certification in trauma-informed practices, and almost immediately, the impact became evident. In the second week of the program's operation, a 9-year-old victim of sexual assault was able to testify with the support of a golden retriever named Sunshine. The defendant was convicted. The prosecutor later told Judge, "That child would never have survived cross-examination without that dog present. She found her courage through that animal." A domestic violence victim in her 60s found her voice with the help of a standard poodle, breaking years of silence about abuse she'd endured. Her testimony resulted in a protective order and connected her with support services she desperately needed. A child who'd witnessed a violent crime was able to provide testimony that led to the conviction of a dangerous criminal. His parents later wrote to Judge, "Your program gave our son back his childhood. He's not having nightmares anymore." The statistics began to accumulate. Witness participation rates increased by 43%. Conviction rates in cases using the program increased by 38%. Most importantly, victim satisfaction scores improved dramatically. These weren't just numbers. They were individual lives changed, families protected, justice served with humanity. Emma herself continued to heal. By her 5th birthday, she was attending regular preschool, making friends, speaking fluently. The trauma that had silenced her was still part of her history, but it no longer defined her present. She asked about Bella frequently. An officer made a point of bringing the dog to visit her whenever possible. Judge received letters from other judges asking how to implement the program in their states. Media outlets requested interviews. She was invited to present at national judicial conferences. Academic papers began to emerge, analyzing the program's effectiveness and replicating its success. But the moment Judge treasured most was quiet and personal. It was when Emma, now speaking confidently and clearly, ran to Bella at the courthouse and threw her arms around the dog's neck, not as a traumatized child seeking refuge, but as a healthy child greeting her friend. "Thank you, Bella," Emma said clearly, her small voice filled with genuine affection. Officer caught Judge's eye, and they exchanged a smile that acknowledged the profound truth of that moment. Sometimes the most important transformations happen not in grand ceremonies, but in simple acts of connection between a child and an animal who refused to judge her pain. The dream had been built. Now it was time to watch it grow. 5 years had passed since Emma whispered those 2 life-changing words in Judge's courtroom. The child who had been silenced by trauma was now 8 years old, sitting in her second-grade classroom with her hand raised enthusiastically, answering a math question with confidence that no one who'd known her then would have believed possible. Her teacher, Mrs., smiled warmly as Emma explained how she'd solved a multiplication problem. The girl's voice was strong and clear, carrying no trace of the fear that had once locked it away. Emma's life had become beautifully, gloriously normal. She attended school without anxiety. She had friends, real friendships characterized by laughter and play and the ordinary drama of childhood. She lived with her grandmother in a comfortable home filled with love and safety. She attended therapy occasionally, not because she was broken, but as a maintenance practice, a way of ensuring that the trauma didn't resurface. Her therapist doctor had written in her final assessment, "Emma demonstrates remarkable resilience and complete integration of her traumatic experience. She is a thriving, healthy child." Her mother remained in prison, serving a 15-year sentence for child endangerment and assault. Emma had processed this reality with surprising maturity, understanding, as much as an 8-year-old could, that her mother's choices had consequences. She didn't hate her mother, but she'd learned to protect herself, to choose safety over loyalty. Meanwhile, the Courthouse Companion Animal Program had exploded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Judge stood in her office, reviewing reports from across the state. The pilot program that had started with 12 courthouses and 40 dogs had expanded to 53 courthouses with over 180 trained therapy animals. 5 other states had contacted her directly, asking for guidance on replicating the program. A national consortium of judges was forming to standardize protocols and share best practices. Academic institutions had begun offering specialized training in animal-assisted judicial proceedings. The statistics were staggering. Over 2,400 vulnerable witnesses had with animal support. Conviction rates in supported cases were 41% higher than the national average. Victim satisfaction scores had improved by 53%. Witness participation rates had increased by nearly half. Post-traumatic stress symptoms in victims decreased significantly. But beyond the numbers, there were the stories, hundreds of them, stories of children who'd found their voices, domestic violence survivors who'd escaped dangerous situations because they could finally testify, sexual assault victims who'd broken their silence. Each story represented a life changed, a family protected, a dangerous person held accountable. Officer had become a nationally recognized expert on trauma-informed law enforcement and animal-assisted justice. He'd been invited to present at the National Judges Conference, the American Bar Association, and law enforcement conventions across the country. Bella, now aging gracefully at 11 years old, had become something of a celebrity. She'd been featured in national news stories, academic journals, and even a documentary about innovative approaches to justice. But the recognition that meant the most came in the form of an award. Judge was summoned to the state capitol on a crisp November morning. She was told there would be a special ceremony, but she wasn't prepared for what awaited her. The State Judicial Excellence Award for Innovation in Child Protection was being given to her, officially recognizing the revolutionary impact of the Courthouse Companion Animal Program. As she stood at the podium, holding the award and looking out at the assembled judges, legislators, and advocates, Judge felt the weight of 5 years of work, the skepticism she'd faced, the resistance from traditionalists, the countless meetings where she'd had to defend and justify and explain, but it had all been worth it. "This award belongs to many people," she said, her voice steady and passionate. "It belongs to Officer, whose vision and expertise created the framework for this program. It belongs to the hundreds of trained therapy dogs who sat quietly in courtrooms, offering their simple presence to traumatized witnesses. It belongs to the advocates and psychologists and administrators who believed that justice could be both rigorous and compassionate." She paused. "But most of all, this award belongs to a 3-year-old girl named Emma Richardson, who taught us that sometimes the most powerful tool for justice is not found in law books or procedure manuals. It's found in the unconditional presence of another living being." Officer watched from the audience, tears streaming down his face. Bella sat at his side, her gray-muzzled face turned toward the podium, as if she understood that she was being honored. 3 months later, Emma celebrated her 8th birthday with a party that included her grandmother, her school friends, Doctor, and, most importantly, Officer and Bella. The years had been gentler on Bella than on her handler. The dog moved more slowly now, her joints showing the stiffness of age. But her eyes remained bright, and her connection with Emma was as profound as ever. Emma, no longer the silent, traumatized child but a confident, articulate girl, spent hours with Bella at the party. She talked animatedly about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian or perhaps a judge like Judge. She spoke with the easy fluency of a child who had fully reclaimed her voice. "Do you remember," Emma asked Officer at one point, "when I couldn't talk?" "I do," he said gently. "I'm glad I can talk now," Emma said matter-of-factly. "And I'm glad Bella helped me. She's the best dog in the whole world." Bella's tail wagged slowly, and she rested her head on the child's lap, a gesture of reciprocal affection that had defined their relationship since that day in the courtroom. Judge arrived at the party bearing gifts and hugs. She found Emma, and the judge bent down to embrace the girl who had changed her life and her career. "I have something to tell you," Judge said. "Today, a girl who's 11 years old in my courtroom about abuse she experienced. She was able to speak because of the program that you helped create. She's going to be safe now because you were brave enough to whisper those 2 words." Emma's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Judge confirmed. "You're still helping people, Emma. Every day, your courage is helping new people find their voices." Emma processed this information with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who was beginning to understand her own power. "That's good," she said finally. "That's really good." As the sun set on Emma's birthday party, Judge stood with Officer, watching the children play and the dogs rest peacefully in the evening light. "Do you remember," Officer asked, echoing Emma's earlier question, "that day in the hallway when you asked if Bella could help?" "I do," Judge smiled. "I was desperate. I didn't know if anything would work." "Neither did I," Officer admitted. "But I knew Emma needed something. I knew the system needed something. I just didn't know it would lead to this." He gestured toward the scene before them, a thriving child, celebrating her 8th birthday with joy and security. A program that had expanded across the state and beyond. A judicial system that was slowly, incrementally becoming more humane without compromising its rigor or justice. 5 years ago," Judge said quietly, "I thought I was a successful judge. I'd presided over thousands of cases. I'd made sound legal decisions. But I hadn't understood that true justice wasn't just about applying law correctly. It was about creating space for healing alongside accountability. Officer nodded. Emma taught us that. In the distance, Bella lifted her head, looking toward the girl who had changed everything. The dog's tail wagged slowly, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of transformation, individual, institutional, systemic. Emma's whispered words, "Mommy hurt," had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. They transformed one courtroom, then one courthouse, then an entire state's judicial system. They'd changed the lives of thousands of vulnerable witnesses. They'd created a new model for compassionate justice. But most importantly, they'd given one traumatized child her life back. As Emma laughed with her friends, her voice strong and clear and full of joy, Judge understood that this was what justice truly meant. Not just holding accountable those who caused harm, but creating the conditions for victims to heal, to speak, to reclaim their futures. The legacy would continue. Other states would implement the program. Other children would find their voices. Other Bellas would sit quietly in courtrooms, offering the simple gift of non-judgmental presence to those struggling to speak their truth. But it had all begun with one child, one dog, and one judge brave enough to break the rules to serve justice. Emma had whispered 2 words that changed the law. Now countless others would benefit from her courage, spoken so softly but heard so loudly. The end.